My name is Elle Siegel. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Trails Conservancy. We're so glad you made time to join us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're coming in from. I am the Advocacy Outreach Director here at Rails to Trails, and our topic today is the post-election landscape, next steps for the Trails and Active Transportation movement. And we are joined by Kevin Mills, Rails to Trails' Vice President of Policy, who's going to have a really robust, dynamic discussion for us, looking at the election and what this means for our movement. So that'll get started in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Kevin. Thanks again for joining us, and please write down your questions as they come up.
Yeah, thanks, Elle. So I want to start with a note of optimism. Attitudes towards walking and biking are changing. They're being taken more seriously as a building block of vital, sustainable communities. Conditions on the ground are improving. Communities are becoming more walkable and bikeable. And culture shift is really spreading. And this is, and that's in communities, all sorts of size of communities and types and what have you. And so this has really been a change that's a long time coming. And where we think one of the big accelerants for this has been the unprecedented investment in trails and active transportation over the last few years through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And right now, because of that, we have a robust pipeline of projects that are at all stages of development in most regions of the country. And what we see going along with that is growing demand for connected walking and biking infrastructure. That is safe routes for everyone to get just about anywhere in a community. And this diagram is of the circuit in the Philadelphia-Camden region, which is just an exemplary and ambitious regional network of trails that connect people to places. And this is happening in urban, suburban, and rural areas. And we also are seeing increasingly that people are willing to pay for these things. When trails are on the ballot, we win. So next slide, please. So let's look at a very bright spot from the election in November, which was state and county ballot measures. On the county front, one that's just really wonderful to have seen was Franklin County, Ohio. That's where Columbus is. And they passed a sales tax that'll support transit in a very robust way and includes $60 million every year for active transportation in a single county in Ohio. It's very impactful. There's also was a conservation measure in Lake County, Florida, that yielded $25 million for trails. And then two counties in Iowa that we worked with passed ballot measures. In Story County, $8 million for trails, and Johnson County, $30 million for conservation, with trails being among the eligible uses of that money. And so we've seen this in many other counties all around the country. These were some of them that RTC directly engaged in and backed. Next slide, please. There were also very successful state ballot measures around the country. Some of the ones we were involved with were in Maine, where there was a $30 million trail bond for maintenance and construction. In California, there was a massive $10 billion climate measure that of which nearly $2 billion is in programs for which trails and active transportation are eligible to benefit. And so a large opportunity there in California. And then in Washington, similarly, they rejected a repeal of their climate law, and that preserved all sorts of funding for active transportation, among other things, that would help cut climate emissions. And that also was a value of more than $1 billion in that state. So what we've seen all around the country is all the ballot measures that we as an organization supported one-handedly, and that it was also true for some of our partner organizations that backed other ballot measures. And all told, by some estimates, there was more than $25 billion that was approved by voters this year through ballot measures at the state and local level. So with that bright spot, let's move to the next slide. So in state elections, that's the next category I want us to look at, looked at gubernatorial races. Overall, not looking at any particular places, the results were fairly unsurprising, not a lot of big shifts. But we certainly had, as a trails organization, had some champions at the governor level that retired due to term limits. And so we saw that on both sides of the aisle with Governor Inslee in Washington and Governor Holcomb in Indiana being among the retiring governors. And so those are places where advocates in those states for trails and active transportation will need to rebuild a new relationship with new people in power. In state legislatures, I would say overall there was a trend in the direction of the Republicans, but of course it depended which state you're in, what that looks like. In Michigan, the House was shifted to Republican control, and in Minnesota, it shifted to a tie from Democratic control. And so each of those states had complete one-party control, and now that is mixed. And then there were supermajorities that ended for both the Democrats and Republicans, Democrats in Vermont and Republicans in Montana and Wisconsin, where they lost that control that they had at the state legislative level. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to get my light back on. All right, thanks. So we have federal programs that are implemented by the state. So this is federal money, but it comes down, as most transportation programs do, it comes down to the state level, and in some cases, sub-allocated down to metropolitan areas through what are called metropolitan planning organizations. And so these programs are implemented at both the state and local level in many cases. Transportation Alternatives is the largest source of funding for trails, walking, and biking in the country. And it's over $1.4 billion a year or across the country. And RTC has tracked how this money has been used by the states for the entire life of that program, going back to when it was transportation enhancements more than 30 years ago. And we published that data in something called our trade report. And we are going to have a webinar about a deep dive on how this program's faring in recent years this next week on December 9th. And so these are opportunities to kind of dig in deeper on this this very special program and how you can advocate for the best possible program in your state. But it's been very interesting to see some states embrace some of the reforms that were made possible by the last reauthorization, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Things like providing more technical assistance to disadvantaged communities to take advantage of the program, giving grants and greater grant size so that they can have a greater strategic impact, and cutting down on the amount of money transferred to other programs. Although we have our eye on the fact that about a handful of states still are transferring money out of this program, and we see that as something to address going forward. So in any case, that's critical program. And then the Recreational Trails Program also dedicated money for trails that has strong bipartisan support, and it uses gas taxes from trail vehicles, the motorized trail vehicles, but then the trails that can be built with the money can be either non-motorized or motorized. And then there's the Carbon Reduction Program, a new one under the bipartisan infrastructure law that basically asks states to plan and then allocate what is essentially flexible money to address the issues that they've identified. And we found it encouraging. We actually have a blog about how this program is going in some states, and there are some surprising cases where states have really stepped up and for the very first time really started to invest in transportation options that would help them cut their emissions. And so we're encouraged by those fresh approaches in some states. And the Highway Safety Improvement Program, another longer standing program for which there was a new rule under the bipartisan infrastructure law that said if your state has more than 15% of the road fatalities are among pedestrians and bicyclists, then you need to spend at least that much addressing those risks. And so we've seen some really encouraging developments under that. So here's some just good examples of the federal money being implemented in your states and making a big difference. And one of the things to keep in mind with this is even if priorities change in Washington, there's an authorization cycle for federal transportation law. The current one sunsetting in late 2026, and that those programs tend to be less impacted by the political winds in Washington, D.C. Until you get to the next reauthorization. And so there can be a delay there, and where state dynamics can be the most important thing to have your eye on when you're thinking about how well those programs get authorized. Next slide, please. So at the congressional level in this election, Republicans maintained their narrow House majority, and then they won a Senate majority. And so now they have what we referred to before as a trifecta of control with the presidency and both houses of Congress, but a narrow one, at the federal level. So there are a number of things that we're trying to watch given this development. One is the Senate filibuster rule. So in the U.S. Senate, for most legislation, there are exceptions, but for most legislation, you need 60 votes to pass something. So that means that even when you have 53 Republican seats, as we do going into next year, you would still need some bipartisanship to get things passed, unless they decide to change the rules. And there's been talk of that in recent years on both sides of the aisle, depending who's in power, of changing the rules such that a regular majority might rule. If that happened, then Republicans would be able to move more quickly with their priorities. Of course, if it happened and in another cycle, Democrats took control, they'd be able to move more quickly. And that's the trade-off that the parties weigh when they think about what the filibuster rule ought to be. Fiscal 25 budget but should have been put to bed by October 1st, but it was extended till just before Christmas. And now there's talk on Capitol Hill of extending it further till March. There's some pushback about that idea as well, but we've got our antenna up for whether that's going to be brought in for a landing sooner or later, but it will be later than, well into the fiscal year before they pass it. And the thought there on the part of the Republicans in control is that this will give a chance for the current administration to put their the incoming administration to put their imprint on the current year's budget in a way that usually is let go, but in this case might be in play. Transportation reauthorization, I'd mentioned before, this is the every 5-6 year bill that's passed to set a new federal transportation law. And we have a big question this time about whether it will proceed on time and get done in late 2026. And one of the reasons for that uncertainty about whether it'll proceed on time is that there's something called the fiscal cliff, which means there's a highway trust fund that's funded by gas taxes, and that is scheduled by 2028 to be insufficient to cover the obligations from the authorization of the bill. So given that, part of the next reauthorization debate needs to be, how do we raise revenue? And that's always a very difficult conversation to have here in Washington, particularly in an election year, which 2026 is. So for those reasons, people think this might get kicked down the road a bit, but we absolutely have to be ready for the committees responsible for this bill to start policy debates in earnest in 2025 in preparation for trying to do something on time. And so it is basically showtime, even though the final result might be delayed somewhat. Finally, there's some questions about what the philosophy that will govern this bill will be. One of the things we've got our antenna up for is the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 articulated a devolution agenda where they believe that walking and biking ought to be the responsibility of states and localities, not the federal government. We dealt with that same governing philosophy during the reauthorization debate that was known as MAP 21 about a dozen years ago. We did not lose our programs at that time, but they were seriously threatened, and it was a big fight. So antenna are up as to whether there could be a repeat of such a debate, but there are other scenarios here as well. I just wanted to apprise you of that risk that we are watching. Another risk that we're watching is that rail banking, the foundational law that supports the rail trail movement, where railroad corridors that are not being currently used for trains can be kept in public use to remain available for use by trains by turning them into multi-use trails. And this law was subject of a bill challenging its integrity in the recent months. And we have our antenna up as to whether that will be pursued as some kind of priority next year or not. And if it is, that will be a big topic of action for us and our allies. Next slide, please. So the election results also affect, of course, what happens in the executive branch. We'll have a new set of folks in the White House, been there before. And so it leads to a question, which is a lot of the talk in the last month has been about government efficiency and cost cutting, and to the point where they're creating kind of a new arm of the White House to work on that. And yet in the first President Trump term, he was expressed that he was very a builder and very in favor of investing in infrastructure and for our economic competitiveness, both domestically and internationally. So it is very important for us to kind of have our radar up for whether that will be the main governing philosophy, or whether there might be cost cutting. And what I would say is that we could, to a degree, where that is where there might be deregulation opportunities around transportation relating to environmental rules or labor rules, for instance. Then I think we could see this administration take aim at those things, but at the same time say they do want to see money flow to infrastructure, at least infrastructure that they deem important. And so that is why when we think about what will be their first 100-day priorities, we want to know whether we're going to be somehow in that picture or not. My best guess would be that things that are kind of more in the political eye, like immigration and tax cuts, would be the first 100-day priorities, and not things related to transportation per se. But it remains to be seen what they will do, because and why that's important is that the things done first are often the most likely to pass, because the party tends to be united as they get started, and then divisions show up over time, and then you get closer to elections, and it becomes harder to do things that have any controversy around them, and so on. So it's just an important thing to keep an eye on. We do have a nominee for the U.S. Department of Transportation head, be Sean Duffy. He was a congressman from northwestern Wisconsin in the teens. He's currently has been on Fox News, and it seems that he has not a lot about transportation on his resume, but he has TV skills, loyalty to the president, and those are some of the things that have been valued in some of the picks we've seen so far. So that is, kind of remains to be seen. I do think, given that the emphasis on this administration on loyalty, as well as the fact that there's not a long resume on Mr. Duffy's part, suggests that whatever is prioritized out of the White House will be on his radar screen in a significant way. But it also suggests that there'll be many things beyond that the department has to handle. And so the appointments that are made underneath Mr. Duffy will be they are always important. Those level of appointments may be more important than ever for us in the coming months to see who gets appointed there. So but one thing to be sure is that the new team will have an opportunity to reset the priorities for certain programs, and that's where we want to go to the next slide and talk about some of those issues. Excuse me, my lights, when I don't move, it turns off. So I had to reset that. All right, so there are discretionary grant programs, competitive grant programs that it means, that are implemented directly by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And these are of particular interest for us because they are areas where our movement has been doing very, very well in the last few years. Just in 2024, really at what the peak of bipartisan infrastructure law implementation, we saw just from these first two here, RAISE, which is about sustainability and equity, and the Reconnecting Communities program, which is an equity program, that there was, in the case of RAISE, 425 million that went to walking and biking projects, as well as walking and biking being part of many other projects that were funded beyond those. And then the Reconnecting Communities program was $834 million of walking, biking, and trail projects. So you can see between those, it was a big infusion of investment this year in our priorities. And so one thing that will be interesting is there's currently a call for proposals under RAISE, where some of the projects that didn't get funded in the last round will have a quick chance to get funded before the current administration leaves, and then the next administration will inherit a set of applications in what's called round two of the current proposals. And one thing we do want to mention too with these programs is if you've gotten a prior grant but don't have your grant agreement signed yet, this is a good time to be knocking on DOT's door and suggesting they get it signed so that you have a little bit more of kind of you're on your way element to your work that make it less likely you'd be vulnerable to any rethinking about past grants. And we don't really have any way of knowing whether that might happen or not. And there's really not a lot of precedent for awarded grants to be rethought, but there could be some unconventional thinking in certain quarters as the new folks take control. So that's something to keep in mind. So one thing about the Reconnecting Communities program is that the current administration feared that if they lost control, the program would not continue. So they accelerated future years of funding into this year, and they've already made all those grants. So that program is basically over for this reauthorization cycle. The RAISE program could continue, and it has advance appropriations, so it's likely to continue. And during the first Trump administration, they called this program Build, and in that case, did sometimes fund biking and walking projects, but only as part of a multimodal project, along with some road or transit investments. So just a different set of priorities. We could, jury's out on whether those same priorities will come back again or whether they'll rethink it for future rounds of RAISE, or maybe rename it something else. But in any case, it is there. Safe Streets and Roads for All is an interesting program that, again, to be determined what the priorities will be, but these have been driven by state safety plans and local priorities in terms of what to apply for. So there's some hope that if states and localities are consistent in pushing forward good ideas that really will enhance safety, that safety is a bipartisan issue, and we'll see some continuity in terms of how that's handled. The Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, top priority for us here at RTC, because it's a very strategic way to invest in walking and biking infrastructure, where you think about taking the existing infrastructure and connecting it together to get people to the places they need to go and to get people between communities. And so this is very important to us. The first awards under this program are pending, expected to be out in the next month. And then we're working on appropriations for coming years to make sure it continues. And of course, reauthorization, it will be a priority for us. Next. So this leaves us thinking about some key next steps for our movement. And one is we've just, always got to be thinking about organizing supporters, but this is a particularly important time to make sure that we're really lifting up all the voices of different kinds of places and people who support what we're all trying to do together. And that we really want to lean in on the fact that there's just so many different kinds of benefits from from active transportation infrastructure, and that we want to really get everybody to come out of the woodwork and speak up for it. Second thing is that we need to engage decision makers across the political spectrum and then across federal, state, and local levels. And the who matters. And so there's definitely some targeting that happens here to think about who's running key committees and things like that, so that we're cultivating the people who will have the most say over the matters that matter to us. And then we want to advance our projects. I mentioned at the outset that there was a robust pipeline of projects, many with funding to move them to the next level, whether that be planning or construction or whatever. And that the changes on the ground you get when you move those projects forward more quickly become our evidence base for the great impact that these projects have, how they improve communities, and that just makes more converts to the importance of doing this. And then similarly, we want to use our communications tools to inspire and persuade people, telling the stories of successes on the ground, making sure that we have the right messengers and messages, the right people saying the right things, and the right values coming forward, so that the decision makers will see that this is something that benefits their constituents and benefits them and their priorities. And next slide, which is about questions and discussions. So presumably people have been dropping their questions in the Q&A box, and I would be glad to see if I have answers.
Kevin, we have a question for you that we put in the Teams chat, but I can read it out loud.
Okay, please do.
Sure, I'll read it out loud for you. Where did it go? Here. If a project has received discretionary grant funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law, do you think it will be honored under the new administration?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we've been kind of poking around about. So what I'd say is there's very little precedent for the answer being no. That is that the norm is for any grant agreements, or I should even go further than that, that awards that have been already announced, that they, of course, those are pursuant to official calls for proposals and then a very formal process for choosing the most deserving projects to get awarded, that those have been honored by subsequent administrations in the past. But the legal answer as to whether they must honor all those grant announcements is not as clear. So there's possibility that they might reconsider some of those. That is why I mentioned getting your grant agreements signed. I suppose there could not be a guarantee that there might not be a challenge to some of those if they had not yet begun to be implemented, but we think that is another degree of insulation for you if you've got a signed grant agreement. I think there's a better argument that you might have some legal protection, that money had been promised to you and you can start relying on it, and that reliance gives you a measure of protection. So. Next question. Okay.
I can keep reading them if you prefer.
I see one asking about more about the bill challenging the integrity of rail banking. So Representative Sam Graves from Missouri introduced a bill this fall that would put a series of requirements on doing a rail banking agreement that would effectively make it impossible to use the law. And so we effectively see this as an attempt. It could be an attempt to destroy the practice of rail banking. What we don't know is whether this will be moved forward. We don't see any prospect of it being dealt with during this lame duck session where they have so little time and so much to do. but depending on what their priorities are in 2025, we could see an attempt to queue that bill up and have a debate about it. And that's just something we're preparing to answer. So, but basically the thing to know about it is it might be cloaked in a language of reform of the process, but in reality, they would make it practically impossible to ever use the law. So it's tantamount to eliminating the law. More questions here. Okay. So there's a question about in terms of appealing to the Republican leadership and Congress, what kinds of benefits of these projects do we want to lean into? And that's an excellent question. And and I think that fits in with what I was saying about thinking about your messages, your messengers, and the values that are being reflected. And one of the benefits of the work we all do is that there's so many kinds of benefits, and you can think about emphasizing the things that are of most importance to the decision maker you're talking about. Know who you're talking to, and one thing we've tended to see is that economic benefits of trails and active transportation tend to resonate more in Republican districts as compared to, say, mobility benefits. That is, walking and biking as transportation might have a little less resonance, but the economic development value of them is highly priced. So that's one thing to keep in mind. At the federal level, one thing that I've experienced is offices being very receptive to seeing concrete examples of how these programs have been used in their district to make a difference. So, being specific about the projects that have moved forward and benefited from these programs is really resonant. As sometimes is on a philosophical level, the idea that the federal role includes interstate commerce and often regional active transportation networks, as well as long distance trails, will cross state lines, making them interstate commerce the same way roads are. And that's something that's been resonant for certain Republican offices. Looking for another question. Yeah, okay. It's a similar question about strategies for advancing projects in places where the priority is not really to think about the equity or sustainability of a project. So similarly, just thinking about what it is that is being valued. So I'd say, along with the economic value, and then that can take different forms. We've seen small towns where they call themselves trail towns because they've really, brought themselves back to economic prominence around trail tourism, and so that's something that's worked really well. So it may depend on the circumstances in a particular district, what you want to lean into, but I think general quality of life related things, the idea of how it's widely valued in the community to have these assets, and then maybe thinking about individual people in these districts that matter to the decision maker who agree that these are important things for the community. So those are some of my thoughts on that. Feel free to call out questions I haven't seen come through the chat if you'd like, and I'll also look for some here.
Yeah, Kevin, there's a couple questions on if you could elaborate on the future of ATIP, the future of RAISE, and then a question about the Trump administration previously potentially wanting to move where TAP where the Transportation Alternatives Program was housed, and if you know any insights there.
Okay. I'm not sure I know what the last point's referring to. You're saying the previous Trump administration wanted to move where it was housed?
He wanted to change the department TAP was housed in. Is this accurate? Do you think this will happen again?
Okay. So let's talk about RAISE and ATIP. So RAISE, I think in my initial remarks, I was kind of pointing to using past as prologue, perhaps, and looking at the fact that the first Trump administration, when it was looking at what was then called the Tiger program under the Obama administration, where it was created, and they said, well, we could get rid of this program or we could grow it. It was subject to yearly appropriations, and they or continue it, and they decided to continue it and to rename it Build, and to really put an emphasis on multimodal projects that were of benefit to driving and transit and walking and biking, and definitely there was more money flowing to rural districts through that program. There was more money flowing to driving than has been true in the current administration. But I guess the thought is the program did get continued. And then in the current administration, it has grown. And in the reauthorization, one of the reasons it's grown is that it got what's called advance appropriations. And what that means is, it wasn't through the Highway Trust Fund, but they basically promised future years' budget allocations to it. And we could see that challenged, but it is possible that they'll say, whoa, this is a chunk of change that's authorized by the bipartisan infrastructure law, advance appropriated, and that we want the chance to give that money away according to our priorities. So that's one possibility. Another could be, well, we're trying to bring the budget under control and want to spend less, and they could decide to do away with it. But more likely, they might say, we'll not fight the advance appropriations, but maybe we won't add additional yearly appropriations on top of it. So it could become continue, but not be quite as big. But then how will it be awarded? Again, I figure there'll be new priorities. You'll see probably more going. There is already a requirement in RAISE, though, that some of it be going to rural and some be going to urban. So I don't think the change there will be night and day. But you could see a kind of a relative reweighting of types of projects that get the money. And then reauthorization, it just depends on what rises to the top, whether they want to, how they want to change that or get rid of it or what they want to do. The Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, we're thrilled that the initial round of grants are about to be awarded. We think that this is a vital program for urban, suburban, and rural districts, and for people representing areas from both parties. And so we're really leaning into that, cultivating people on both sides of the aisle as to why it's really beneficial to their communities, and working to get those additional appropriations under the current reauthorization, so that there's enough of a track record that when we get to reauthorization, we can show why this is a particularly high return on investment program compared to any other way you could spend a dollar. So that's our thinking on how to proceed with that. And it'll, the next move, if these are announced in January, will be on Congress to say whether they will appropriate another round of grants with the fiscal 25 money. As far as transportation alternatives, I'll try not to speak in acronym too much. That money is, again, it flows through the states and the larger metropolitan planning organizations. And obviously it does have, a locus of responsibility in the Federal Highway Administration now. But mostly their role is, set guidance and push to allocate that money out to the states so that's why the state priorities become so important in terms of how that money gets actually spent. But because it's dedicated to active transportation, over 95% of the money goes to trails, walking, and biking from that program nationally. It's essentially dedicated money and not one where we're thinking there'll be a rethinking of priorities as there might be in the case of RAISE. So that being said, I do think that there's a possibility there could be some restructuring within federal highways about how these programs are being administered. But that is up in the air, I'd say.
Kevin, we have if it's easier, I can just read you.
Yes, please. That will be helpful.
Yeah, we have a question about emerging. You mentioned that we have a lot of bipartisan support. If there are any emerging Republican champions that we're cultivating in Congress, and then a related question somewhat, are there any health-focused elected officials or federal agencies that can support trails and active transportation?
Mm-hmm. Health-focused committees, is that the idea?
They said legislators, so I'm assuming people who care about public health that may be passionate about it.
Yeah, sure. Great. Yeah. So, okay. So in terms of thinking about active transportation infrastructure investment program, we have long had support from the Alaskan senators, Senator Sullivan and Murkowski, especially Senator Sullivan because he's on the committees, the authorizing committee, and played a role in passage of that law in the authorization. So they continue to be engaged on this issue, and then in the House, the first Republican to step up in support of this program was Representative Ciscomani from Tucson, Arizona, who just had a very tough re-election, won by less than 0.5%. It was like one of those late called races because it was so close. But he did win, and he has vowed to support this program and is well placed in committee-wise to play a role. And then, of course, we're cultivating the people who've got key responsibilities for these things. So on the appropriations end, for instance, Mr. Womack from Arkansas is in charge of the appropriations subcommittee that handles transportation issues, and so we've certainly been in conversations with them. And interestingly, there's on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the people who will do the reauthorization, there is a to be determined battle for control on the part within the Republican Party, where Sam Graves, who I noted previously, has been the chair and is term limited according to Republican caucus rules, but has petitioned leadership for a waiver so that he can continue in that role. But there are others waiting in the wings if he doesn't get that waiver, including Mr. Crawford from Arkansas. So again, interesting to see same state pop up as significant for us in a couple of different key committees. So anyway, those are some of the people who we've been in conversations with. On the health side, the only caution I'd give there, I mean, certainly conceptually, it's a great idea. We of course have some very supportive public health allies, and we really value that interplay between what we do and the idea that provides for outdoor places where people of all economic levels can be physically active and be healthier, and that's a wonderful synergy of our missions. But one of the things that happens at the congressional level that makes that challenging is that there's so much siloing of responsibility for different policy areas, right? So if somebody is a really strong public health advocate in the House of Representatives and wants to be on the health committee, there's not a lot of jurisdiction there over the issues that help get this infrastructure built. And so that's one of the challenges we have in terms of translating that interest and support into policy change.
I'll just chime in and mention, the recreational trails program has a lot of bipartisan support as well. And so leveraging that, and that includes an incoming, a former House member who's now in the Senate, soon to be Senator Curtis from Utah, Representatives Matt Malloy and Stauber, and then Senator Risch as well. So those are definitely allies to champion as well. Kevin, we have a question on the timing of reauthorization.
Yep.
If you can expand upon that a little bit.
Yes. So it was a 5-year authorization passed in November of 2021. But I believe the money part went through fiscal year 26, which is the end of September of 2026. So, but point being is that we are now less than 2 years out from the sunset of that bill, and it is the norm that in the year prior to that the policy discussions about what ought to be in that bill really heat up. And so we are anticipating that to be a topic of conversation in 2025. But that being said, for some of the reasons I noted in my remarks about fiscal cliff and what have you, and also it's actually fairly routine that there be extensions of transportation bills for a year or maybe two, that there could be a reason this doesn't get done on time, but that's not a reason to not be fully engaged in the policy formulation stage, because often what happens is that there might be some policy debate that happened the year before the sunset that gets locked in. They come to an agreement, they see no reason to upset the apple cart, and so that agreement carries through, even if it's 2 years before the bill actually gets passed and signed by the president. And so that's why you have to play as though it's for keeps, even if the final finish line, it might be farther off. So that's some of our thinking about tactics on the timing of reauthorization. But one thing that's interesting about it is that if there are extensions, of course, they'll have another election in late 2026. It's hard for Congress to do a bill like that in an election year. So that's another reason why there could be an extension. But if you're the Republicans and you control all the levers, and if this is the thing you decide to prioritize over other policy areas, then you want to get it done while you control the outcome. And so that might be a reason to hurry it along in 2026. But it remains to be seen. And stay tuned. What else do we have queued up?
There's one more question in the chat, but we have more time, so please keep adding your questions. There's a question about the EPA's Community of Change Grant Program. And again, we can kind of expand that out. It has rolling applications, but it's more climate-based. And just curious if you have any thoughts on, I know you kind of expanded upon the at-risk programs, but I think people are still looking, again, for some guidance on, at-risk discretionary grant programs and how to be mindful of those moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I guess the answer is if they are always subject to reinterpretation as to how best to implement them. And then, and so that's, maybe I'd take that part as a given. And if it is about, for instance, if the program is about equity or climate inequity, you can be, sure that there are some different views from the political appointees coming in to run the agency as compared to the prior people. And And so, that'll be reflected in what rises to the top if the program continues. In the case of that EPA program, I'm not familiar enough with the statutory underpinnings to know whether it might be its continuation is in question, or whether it is only subject to that reprioritization.
I think we probably have time for one more question. So just, I guess, any final takeaways as we're wrapping up, how we can kind of gear up for some changes, what we can be thinking about, and what would you leave us with, Kevin?
Yeah, no, I just it's an interesting time. That's why I started with the optimistic note about how things are changing on the ground, how the resonance of the importance of having safe places to walk and bike has really grown, and that you can find people in any sort of community who basically saying, yeah, that's what I want for my community, and that's something really significant for us to build from. And so I think we need to engage at all levels, local, state, and federal, to kind of get that across and build on the momentum that we have. And I do think when a tactic shows itself to be of growing significance, like the ballot measures, I think we need to lean into that and invest more in using those tactics. And then, but I don't think we concede anything at any level. We have a popular issue, and we want to amplify that strong support and build on it, and make this something that's widely assumed to be essential community assets, things that everybody's got to have the kind of community that people really, really want to live in. And so we all have a role in getting to that place where that's the prevailing culture and policy surrounding these issues. And so with that, I think we can wind that up. Do you have any closing thoughts for us, Elle, or?
Nothing immediate. Just thank you all. Just as always, we'll be continuing to update our website with more information, whether it be about reauthorization, existing NOFOs, actions you can take. I think in the chat we've highlighted a couple other webinars we have coming up on the Transportation Alternatives Program, as well as on the importance of federal work more broadly as part of our Changemaker for Trails series. So please, we hope to see you at one of those. And if not, happy holidays, and stay tuned for more soon.